Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 61 for Sunday the 8th of September 2019, and this week we are examining 13 Days, released in 2000 and portraying the drama of 1962's Cuban Missile Crisis from the point of view of President John Kennedy and his team of advisors. My name is Martin Darlington, and with me as ever is Andrew Blischig. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Martin. How are you going?
Yeah, good.
Excellent. Let's start as we usually do with updates and errata. We want to just give another huge thank you to Des Latham for joining us last time out on Breaker Morant. The show has already had some great feedback and we've noticed a real boost to our listeners' numbers. That's probably down to Des giving us a very enthusiastic plug on his recent show. So if there are any migrants from the Anglo-Boer War podcast, you're all very, very welcome. And we hope that we can live up to the standards you've gotten used to from Des's marvellous series.
And we have a review. Gave us 5 stars in Apple Podcasts by Gal from Nebraska. Hello and thank you. From the USA, of course. On August 25th, she said, "I like this podcast because I like history and movies. The guys do a great job of investigating the true facts and comparing them to the movie. I like the way they rate the movies in 2 categories for entertainment and factual content at the end of the podcast. They're both easy to listen to and professional." Well, thank you very much, Gal from Nebraska. That is greatly appreciated.
Oh, shucks. We also have to pay tribute to listener Ben Robertson, who some time ago pointed us at this movie, letting us know, 13 Days, letting us know that he lived through the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis that are portrayed in the movie. And although he was very young at the time, he remembers the fear and uncertainty of that autumn, or would have been fall, where Ben was growing up. So thank you for pointing us in this direction, Ben. And we've also got some listener feedback. We heard from Ryan Ramsayer recommending Tucker, The Man and His Dreams, a movie that Martin says he'd never heard of. I do recall it, but I didn't see it at the time. It stars Jeff Bridges as Preston Tucker, an inventor who envisaged a car for the masses but was blocked by the Detroit auto manufacturers. It was directed by Francis Ford Coppola and rates 85% positive from the critics on Rotten Tomatoes, but significantly less, 67% positive from viewers. And we'll certainly put it on the list and take a look at it. As others, Ryan has also suggested Untouchables, which is very much on our to-do list, although we might be at some risk of overdosing on Kevin Costner, but we do expect to tackle that one early next year.
Also, our very supportive and thoughtful friend Christine Dockstader wrote in again with a suggestion that is another winner. She's amazing, she just keeps coming up with cracking suggestions. This one is likely to leap onto the shortlist, and it's The People versus Larry Flint. It's a 1996 movie starring Woody Harrelson as Larry Flint, who was the creator of Hustler magazine and his fight against censorship. As Christina comments, whatever you think of Larry Flint himself and what he was standing for, it's a really important movie, and it does raise quite a thorny issue, namely the decision of how far a responsible society can take the principle of free speech. Where does free speech end and, hate talk or incitement to hatred or cruel jokes being made by comedians, where does that start? It gets high 80s scores from both critics and audiences, and although I haven't seen it, I have heard people refer to it as a very important and entertaining movie. So I do think that's one we're definitely going to look at closely. Christina has a lot of knowledge about the case and some good snippets about the movie itself. For example, Woody Harrelson's brother, which I certainly didn't know this. She was telling us that Woody Harrelson's brother was cast as Larry Flint's brother in the movie. So she might find herself being dragged in as a consultant for this one. So, all good stuff. Thank you all. There were some other, I think we heard from Gary Shavit again after Breaker Moran, and thank you, Gary. And I know Dr. Phil has mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis before, Dr. Phil Pomerantz, and they'll get their mentions later on, even though they were kids at the time. I think if for anyone who lived through it, although I do think, I don't think we're giving away any spoilers, that if the world had gone to global thermonuclear war in 1962, now I was born almost exactly 3 years later, and I can't help thinking if my parents had survived and I had still been born, I might have had superpowers because of all the radiation, but probably not.
Probably not. We're grateful that it never happened on all counts then, I think.
No, we are, and of course we'll get into that, and I am being very flippant. So, Now we will talk about the story of the movie after this brief musical interlude.
So, the story of the movie for 13 Days. It was released in late 2000 or maybe even early 2001, and it was written by David Self and directed by Roger Donaldson. And this is the third History by Hollywood movie directed by Donaldson that we'll be reviewing. The other two were 1984's The Bounty and 2005's The World's Fastest Indian. Many critics anticipated problems for this movie due to Kevin Costner's starring role. He certainly adopts a sort of a very strange Boston accent, which we're meant to read as a Boston Irish accent. Rotten Tomatoes rates the movie highly, with critics giving 83% and audiences 80%, a rare case of consensus.
Yeah, at the box office though, it really was definitely a failure. It cost $80 million to make, and yet the worldwide takings only reached 66, and that's a shame because it does have a really strong cast, and they do a great job portraying such well-known figures, such recognisable figures as the Kennedy brothers, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, and other prominent American political figures of the 1960s.
An LA Times article from April of 2001 tells us how Kevin Costner travelled to Cuba for a screening of the movie in front of Fidel Castro. Costner, famously apolitical, was on a trip sanctioned by the US Treasury as a cultural exchange visit, and said that he found it an amazing experience to be watching his movie about a crisis that intimately involved the man who sat a few feet away from him. Castro shared anecdotes and observations with the actor through a translator during the movie, and appeared to be thoroughly enjoying the experience.
Yeah, Robert McNamara, who we've seen featured before in The Post, a long-standing American professional politician. He was defense secretary for a lot of these periods. He said he enjoyed it, and it captured the tension and brinkmanship very well. I we were just talking before we started recording. I'm not quite sure why Kevin Costner went through a phase of being seen as box office poison. I remember around the time Tombstone, which we did, was released, there was Kevin Costner's White Earp, which I did watch. I think I watched it to the end, and it was dreary. Probably very accurate, but dreary. And yet he can be a really good actor, and he's quite good in this. He's quite understated.
Yeah, it's similar to the role set in the similar era where he played the head mathematician engineer in Hidden Figures.
Yeah,
he did a good job at that, I must say.
Yeah,
very, very, very got the tone just right, I thought.
And the Highwayman that we've been plugging, the Netflix movie about the two retired Texas Rangers who hunt down Bonnie and Clyde. It's him and Woody Harrelson, two actors that, Woody Harrelson I've always enjoyed watching. I just think he's got a great screen presence. He comes across as a real person. He's always got some humour. But Costner in there, he's really good. And so, yeah, we're hoping there might be a rehabilitation of Kevin Costner. Now, during our research, Andrew discovered that the number one song in the US hits parade, Billboard chart, whatever, was so incongruous. We're going to lead from the story of the movie into the main part with a little clip. So this is what was number one throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Enjoy.
Then suddenly, to my surprise, he did the monster mash. It was a graveyard smash. It caught on in a flash. He did the monster mash from my laboratory in the castle east.
So let's get into the episode proper with the synopsis and reality check of 13 Days. The opening scenes show missiles being fired into dark skies and atomic explosions as the opening credits roll. It's October 1962, and a U-2 spy plane is flying high in the sky, its camera taking pictures of rural Cuba. We meet the first protagonist, Kenny O'Donnell, played by Kevin Costner, waking in his house surrounded by his 5 children. He is special assistant to President Kennedy, who's played by Bruce Greenwood. As he leaves for work, we see a box delivered under armed guard to an office where two large rolls of film are taken out and developed. So we can assume that these are the photographs taken by the U-2 plane we saw earlier. Analysts then study the photographs and see what are clear images of missiles on transporters. So, short scene, but, how does it set itself up?
Well, yeah, I mean, Kenny O'Donnell is immediately set up as he's like the everyman. He's the guy who's going to explain things to us and lead us through the crisis. And the prime controversy over reality in this movie has probably been the role of Kenny O'Donnell. One of the movie's technical advisors was Graham Allison, a professor of international affairs at Harvard and the author of Essence of Decision about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He says that Kenny O'Donnell, whilst an advisor to JFK throughout the crisis, had nowhere near the impact shown in the movie. However, the producers and director Roger Donaldson say that memoirs confirm that Kennedy asked O'Donnell to be present at all meetings attended by the president. They would then have private meetings to discuss thoughts and ideas. And Donaldson said most of the script is taken directly from Oval Office tapes that were released to them. It's clear O'Donnell divides opinion. One way to judge is that the most positive impressions from him come from outsiders, journalists and movie researchers, whereas the most negative seem to come from government insiders, some of whom may have resented this old college buddy of Bobby Kennedy's, Robert Kennedy's, elbowing his way into the inner circle. He certainly was quite combative, apparently. I've read a few accounts of him saying that he would tell it to the president, and that's one of the things that John Kennedy really appreciated about him. He would never worry about saying something unpopular. He'd just tell it as he saw it. He was no respecter of persons, and that obviously will have grated with some people.
Yeah, I mean, he was clearly one of the Boston inner circle for the Kennedy White House, but the movie has him, going toe to toe with military types, and maybe that is a bit overstated. But let's get back to the movie, shall we?
Yeah, and as far as the global scene setting goes, we've actually decided we're going to do that as we go through the movie because it's quite well addressed as we go along. Okay. So we have the character Kenny O'Donnell arriving at the White House. He's met by Jackie Kennedy. She's complaining about a party list, that he's chopped everybody off her invites to a party list, which I think is for one of the kids' birthdays. And he says something like, but none of these guests have any political advantage. And she said, no, but they're my friends. So you get this idea that he's completely focused. If it doesn't benefit the president, he's not interested. He then joins John Kennedy, with whom he clearly has a close relationship, to the point of quite happily stealing the president's toast. Back at the analyst's office, they identify the missiles they've seen, and a representative arrives at the White House and insists to speak to the president. Kenny O'Donnell wasn't in this initial meeting, but then he's called in by JFK. He's shown the photographs and briefed that the Soviets are putting medium-range ballistic missiles into Cuba. The Americans believe them to be SS-4 missiles with a range of around 1,000 miles, which can carry a 3-megaton warhead. We see the White House switchboard frantically connecting calls to the Attorney General, who's Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, played in the movie by Stephen Culp, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, played by Dylan Baker, and a host of others, and they're all basically being brought in. So, how did we get on with that one?
Well, as you've already said, O'Donnell was the special advisor, and he was the diary secretary to the president. So although it seems a bit strange him commenting on guest lists, that would have been a key part of his job. The 14th of October was the date that the U-2 photo reconnaissance plane took some pictures of the Soviet missiles, and the president after that forms this EXCOM, short for Executive Committee, made of key personnel, with experts being brought in to brief them. And this movie shows us how that EXCOM worked, and it does that quite well, I think. What does a range of 1,000 miles do? It puts a lot of America in the eyesights of those Cuban missiles?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much most of the eastern seaboard and quite a way inland. And in reality, they actually found out, I can't remember if they come onto this or not, but they actually find out, in fact they did in the movie, didn't they? Yeah. That there were other missiles as well, which could, I think, anywhere but Seattle.
Correct.
And a potential target.
But even 1,000 miles in the east, the whole eastern seaboard, that is a big deal for the president.
Yeah, absolutely. Incidentally, one criticism as well I read from a movie reviewer was saying, well, it shows Curtis LeMay, who we'll come on to, he's an Air Force general, and General Taylor, who's the head of the army, that they were, it shows them as being part of EXCOM, and they weren't. Well, XCOM had permanent members, and then they'd bring experts in for key meetings. So they might not have been permanent members of XCOM, but Curtis LeMay and General Taylor and Dean Acheson and others would have been part of XCOM meetings, brought in for a specific reason, and maybe not attending all of them. So I think that's a bit of a false accusation.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Back to the movie, we see the men meet as the movie switches to black and white. We learn that this move by the Russians has caught them on the hop. There's the first meeting of XCOM, which has got some government officials, security advisors and military officers. We see them being briefed that there appear to be 32 missiles in place, although they aren't thought to be operational yet. The Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed that they believe that the Soviets are moving to a first strike policy. We've seen Dean Rusk, played by Henry Strozier, as Secretary of State, lay out the options as they see them. Then the Bob reference you'll hear is Defence Secretary Robert McNamara. We've got a little clip of that.
Gentlemen, I want first reactions here. Assuming for the moment that Khrushchev has not gone off the deep end and intends to start World War III, what are we looking at?
Well, Mr. President, I believe my team is in agreement. If we permit the introduction of nuclear missiles to a Soviet satellite nation in our hemisphere, the diplomatic consequences will be too terrible to contemplate. The Russians are trying to show the world they can do whatever they want, wherever they want, and we're powerless to stop them. If they succeed...
It'll be Munich all over again.
Yes, appeasement only makes the aggressor more aggressive. And the Soviets will be emboldened to push us even harder. Now, we must remove the missiles one way or another. Now, it seems to me the options are either some combination of international pressure and action on our part till they give in, or we hit them, an airstrike.
Bob?
We've worked up several military scenarios. Before I ask General Taylor to take us through the various options, I'd like for us to adopt a rule. If we decide to strike, we must agree now to do it before the missiles become operational. Because once they are, I don't think we can guarantee getting them all before at least some of them are launched.
Yeah, so in the clip you heard Dean Rusk speaking, laying out the options, and then the President invites Bob, which is Robert McNamara, and that's the bit about saying, look, if we're going to hit them, we have to hit them before they're operational, which you can understand is quite key, and you've got to make sure you get them all. I mean, 1 3-megaton missile and Miami's history, or wherever they choose to fire it. So in reality, as we said, the XCOM didn't really have a formal structure with different people being brought in and out as required. And one area the movie does quite well is the administration's determination to learn historical lessons, the key one being the result of appeasement of Hitler at Munich. Another key factor in the decision-making process was the previous year's Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, this was an attempt by Cuban counter-revolutionaries, supposedly covertly supported by the Americans, but very much seen as a CIA-sponsored operation. Kennedy had only been inaugurated as president in 1961, and he hadn't really been involved in the planning. And it was Eisenhower, I believe, insisted in the autumn, look, as soon as he won, he needs to be briefed on it, and was asked to sign off. He was assured it would be affected by the CIA, and the disaster that it proved to be made him naturally cautious about accepting further advice from the military and security chiefs.
Yes, and he did a mea culpa in the public about that. He took responsibility for the Bay of Pigs disaster, even though he didn't set it off. He came up with that immortal line, I think, that says, "Success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan." That was in relation to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, from what I can recall.
Good line.
And yes, and you mentioned the fact that they're learning the lesson. You're trying to learn the lesson of having followed the military into the Bay of Pigs, but he's weighing that off with the terrible lessons of appeasement of trying to appease Hitler at Munich. And what I learnt recently in the research for this was that was actually the thesis of Kennedy's political science degree. It was on the lessons of appeasement, of trying to appease Hitler at Munich. So that's a good get, Martin.
So they have these options of international diplomatic pressure or a preemptive strike. Back to the movie, the Kennedy brothers and Kenny O'Donnell walk outside discussing the option. JFK says, look, we can't tolerate nuclear missiles on Cuba, But O'Donnell points out if they attack the missiles and kill Russians, the Soviets will move against Berlin, which then involves NATO, and then we're at war. Robert Kennedy argues if they do nothing, then they're going to be at war anyway, somewhere else, within 6 months. So that you can really see they're between a rock and a hard place. And Berlin comes up again and again because it was such a thorny issue. You know, it was Germany's previous capital city, and of course now again the capital city within East Germany, which was dominated by the Soviet zone, but the city itself divided into French, British, American and Soviet zones. So they talk about involving Congress, the Allies, ExComm, and they asked to bring Dean Acheson in, who's a lawyer and a statesman, and Bobby Kennedy says, look, he was fighting the Soviets when we were all still playing ball at school. So they also agree that they need secrecy. So the president should keep to his published schedule, which means going off on PR trips, which he's very reluctant to do. But if they cancel anything, people are going to start realising, you know, that especially the Washington press will start, their antennae will start twitching, knowing something's up. So at a secret briefing later, a military officer suggests that they strike the missiles, but it will only be a short-term solution unless they also invade Cuba and take out Castro. And Dean Acheson, this veteran statesman, speaks up and he recommends the military option. So JFK sums up saying, you're actually only giving me 3 options, all involving military action. I think there was just airstrikes and invasion, or I can't remember what the third one was. Oh, the blockade option. And there's someone says to the president, can you confirm that we are this is Ted Sorensen, I think, the speechwriter, who's also a special advisor. He said, Mr. President, can you confirm we're shelving all political options? And you can see JFK being given pause to think.
Yeah, but there's a lot in that, and I think it's true to say the movie does do a good job of letting us see the pretty unpalatable choices that Kennedy faced together with his staff. As we've said, an appeasement was an anathema to these men, nearly all of whom had World War II service experience. The younger ones in active military service, the older ones in political or military command. That said, John Kennedy was certainly aware of the likely results of a widespread atomic war. So his dilemma was how to appear strong and resolute, yet still be open and amenable to negotiations. The scene where JFK sums up their 3 viable options, and they're all military ones, seems a little bit incorrect, as diplomatic negotiations was always on the table. But the US starting point was that Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba would not be accepted. So in reality, the 3 main options were 1, negotiate a withdrawal of the missiles, 2, blockade Cuba to prevent further missile equipment and personnel arriving, and 3, strike the missile bases militarily and possibly follow this up with an invasion.
Yeah, so back to the movie, we see JFK again with Bobby Kennedy and Kenny O'Donnell, and JFK says, look, the military chiefs in Acheson, they're going to think I froze in there. The 3 men are all a bit dazed by what they're contemplating. O'Donnell and Bobby Kennedy persuade the president to go to Connecticut for a PR visit as planned again, so they don't alert anybody to the fact that there's a crisis going on. As he arrives, this is in Connecticut, we see Bobby chairing a meeting where he's been told that a strike is the best choice. Robert resists, saying, look, that's a sneak attack, and if our country bombs a small country like Cuba back into the Stone Age, we'll look like the bad guys. It gives us no room for manoeuvre. He demands options. Robert McNamara reveals that they ran a scenario a few months before which calls for a blockade of Cuba. He says, look, it's slow and it doesn't get rid of the existing missiles, but it is a step short of direct military action while still being decisive and preventing any more missiles arriving. So, yeah, the reality are there.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to get this narrative of the film that the military guys are real gung-ho and they want to just go in and go hard, and Kennedy at least being the one that wants to pause and consider things more before, because I think, clearly he would have been bruised by the debacle of the Bay of Pigs a year earlier. This impression that Kennedy had, that the service chiefs thought of him as weak, it does seem to be borne out by transcripts of the meetings of the Oval Office tapes. The bomb them back to the Stone Age comment is attributed to Curtis LeMay, that belligerent senior Air Force officer that we've already mentioned, and it was said about Vietnam a few years later. And it is a good point that that is made in the movie about the blockade option. They'll have to call it a quarantine or something else a bit clever, as blockading a country has been internationally recognised at this time and since as an act of war. Have you got anything to add to the proceedings?
Yeah, I think the movie possibly does paint the military as it's a bit too black and white, that the military are all, let's go get them. Whereas I think what you're doing is when the military they're not being asked to make a political decision, they're being asked to make a assessment of how feasible different military options are, you know, and however pushy they might have been. The Curtis LeMay comment about bombing back to the Stone Age, that was said about Vietnam some years later, and then he tried to dial back from it, and he said, when he was standing for political office, he said, no, I said we were capable of bombing them back to the Stone Age, not that we would, whereas actually the quote quite clearly said that's what we should be doing. Completely believed in strategic bombing as a way of winning wars. But to be fair to him, he was described by Robert McNamara as the most effective combat commander he'd ever seen. And his bomber group, I mean, he was a very senior bomber commander in World War II and led most of the missions that his unit went on. You know, and he was very much a sort of General Patton type. He'd put himself on the line, but he expected all his people to follow him without hesitation. Maybe not the most politically aware of creatures, though.
Yeah, everything would have been black and white, and the one solution, you know, would have been the military one that he's experienced, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the movie. It's now the 20th of October 1962. We see another U-2 plane flying over Cuba, and we see the president being briefed by General Curtis LeMay, who tells him that there are now over 40 Soviet missiles, and they're bigger than they first thought. They're now capable of hitting anywhere in the US apart from the far-flung northwestern city of Seattle. LeMay says that his planes can carry a strike within 3 days of being given the order. The army, to get mobilised, though, would need another week and a half. LeMay only seems to be considering the military options. He says that the Cuban-based missiles give the Soviets a first-strike capability, and he taunts Kennedy by stating that any response other than a military strike would look like weakness. Kennedy pushes back and asks what the Soviets will do when they attack the missiles. LeMay claims they'll do nothing. Kennedy just scoffs and disagrees. As the military officers leave the meeting, they are openly scornful of the Kennedys. The president and his guys are the same. JF quips that if they do what the military want of them, no one will be alive to tell them that they were wrong. We then learn that Andrei Gromyko, the Russian foreign minister, is on his way to meet the president. O'Donnell meets him first with the press corps, and he learns that the army has named their cover exercise to covertly prepare to invade Cuba Ortsac, and it doesn't take the press long to realise that Ortsac is Castro backwards. JFK then meets the Soviet delegation, who assure him that the Soviet support to Cuba is only defensive.
Yeah, well, the bit about Ortsac is unbelievable, but that's true. It was called Exercise Ortsac, and it's Castro backwards, which is just... well, I can only assume that senior military staff... I mean, it's often been said military intelligence is a contradiction in terms, but I think it was designed to be able to be interpreted. Interestingly, though, the producers chose not to portray two scenes which could have contained verbatim lines from recording tapes. The second of which we'll get to later, but the first of which was the military chiefs leaving a meeting and pouring scorn on the Kennedys and their administration in language that is described as meaty. So they really were quite scornful towards the Kennedy administration. So the tension isn't completely manufactured.
I mean, we haven't mentioned this, but Kennedy was an accomplished war hero, wasn't he? He'd survived Pacific Fleet battles, engagements, and won a couple of medals along the way. So it's strange that they would be quite so dismissive of him. Yeah,
he commanded a motor torpedo boat, possibly a squadron. Boat. I'm not sure. Yeah, PT boat. Can't remember what Bobby Kennedy did do something. I can't remember what his role was in the war. I think he was also Navy. Kenny O'Donnell was a bomb aimer in the USAAF, their version of Bomber Command. So these were all World War II veterans who done active service.
And the advice they'd given him a year earlier, the military, was very flawed, and they're not cutting him any slack at all, even though they've let him down.
Yeah, I suspect this is a new generation of military leaders, because I think after the Bay of Pigs there was a bit of a clear out of some of the older ones. Yeah. So back to the movie. Kenny O'Donnell is with the president in Chicago on more PR shindigs, but the press are getting close to the story. Bobby Kennedy calls O'Donnell and says there's a consensus for a blockade, but it's a weak consensus, they need to move fast. And he also mentions that China have invaded India, but no one seems to have noticed. Back in Washington, JFK he flies back to Washington. They come up with a story that he's ill, so he can't continue doing his hand pumping in Chicago. He's briefed as a blockade is the way to go, but they'll call it a quarantine because of this aspect that the blockade is considered an act of war. They know that multiple Soviet ships are on their way to Cuba. The US Navy will intercept them, search them, and confiscate any military equipment. This will prevent any more missiles arriving, but it won't do anything about the ones that are already in situ. However, it will give the Soviets a chance to pull back from the growing confrontation. Meanwhile, the CIA director pushes for an airstrike. Adlai Stevenson, the US ambassador to the UN, he's quite brave. He says, look, I think sometimes in a situation like this, someone needs to be the coward. So I'm going to be the coward. Can we not trade? How about we suggest that we move our missiles out of Turkey and give up Guantanamo, employ a back channel and quietly do a deal? The president says he hasn't decided his course of action yet, but he wants speeches prepared for both quarantine and for airstrikes. So
yeah. Now do we get the mention, Stevenson's mention of missiles in Cuba? Now that's the first we've got any mention of an aggressive position by the Americans, isn't it? In Turkey, thank you. Yes, that's a key point, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and this is really where we need to go back and set the scene. It's quite incredible that at no stage up till now has the movie mentioned Turkey, and that's one major criticism that isn't made about this movie. There's no explanation of why did the Soviets suddenly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. Now, I grew up knowing about the Cuban Missile Crisis and thinking, well, it was Khrushchev maybe coming under pressure from hardliners, trying to appear strong and aggressive in support of Castro, who, let's remember, had always tried to say, look, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, I just want to get on with everybody. He had tried to renegotiate a lot of the deals that Britain, France, and particularly America had with Cuban fruit producers and sugar producers, and everyone had agreed to a fairer cut share of the profits, except particularly United Fruit from America, and that's why the American embargo had started. So Castro's thing was, look, I was forced into bed with the Soviets. I didn't ideologically see them as my brothers, but they offered support, and the Soviet Union were buying Cuban sugar that they didn't really need to just support Castro's economy. Anyway, the year before, in 1961, the Americans sighted some Jupiter missiles, medium range, very similar to the SS-4 Soviet missiles. They positioned them into Turkey. Now, the Khrushchev and the Soviets, Khrushchev was briefed, these are surface mounted. In other words, they're not in nuclear bunkers, they're on the top, on transporters. And the advice from his military leaders were, this is the Americans getting ready for a first strike. They're not in strike protected bunkers, so they would not survive us hitting them. Therefore, they are preparation for an American first nuclear strike. And where they were based in Turkey, they were 100 miles from the Soviet territory. Exactly the same as Cuba. So the deployment of the Soviet missiles into Cuba, yes, it gave Castro some top cover, because of course we'd had the Bay of Pigs the year before as well, where they tried to overthrow him. So he gets protection, but also the Russians are like, you're going to stick missiles 100 miles from our country, we're going to stick missiles 100 miles from yours. So it was very much a quid pro quo. It wasn't this Soviet aggression to the Soviets, it was their reaction to what they perceived as American aggression. We should also mention about the press awareness. Several commentators have said that this is one of the most beneficial aspects of the whole crisis from avoiding escalation and conflict, was that Kennedy had 6 days to contemplate the response with no press or public awareness or Soviet awareness that the Americans knew, how much they did, or how much they did know. So they were able to discuss things away from the glare of public scrutiny, which of course now seems impossible.
Yeah, he got 6 days to, plan, react, think, and without any pressure from the press, which would be, could have been a very, very different outcome if the news could have gotten out earlier.
Yeah, and I have to also admit to some current affair, well, not current affairs now, but recent historical knowledge that I was completely lacking. When I got to the bit in the movie, Bobby Kennedy says, oh, by the way, China's invaded India. I pressed pause, went to Google. I was like, what? I didn't even know that China. I knew China and India had tensions over India hosting the Dalai Lama and Tibet and everything, but I didn't realise they went to war, and they did. On the 20th of October, China invaded the Himalayan border with India in a brief but quite large-scale conflict. No air or naval involvement, no missile involvement. It was just ground troops, and the Chinese pushed the Indians back very rapidly, then stopped and came back to what they called the line of actual control, aka the border as China wished to see it. And that timing seems incredibly convenient, whilst the whole world... But of course, on the 20th of October, the whole world's attention wasn't on Cuba, because we didn't know about it. So you can only assume that the Chinese had inside information. You know, I'm sure
Maybe.
Yeah, and they thought, right, this is about to break, so quickly, let's go in and grab the bit of India that we want. But I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that had happened.
I would have been like you, I think. I would have known there's been tension maybe about the borders way back when, and more recently with the Dalai Lama things, as you said. But for me too, yeah, that was a new one, that there'd actually been a shooting war between the two.
Yeah.
And I've just had a quick Google of Bobby Kennedy's military history. He was not yet 18 when he enlisted in 1943, and he did some initial training. So pretty much when he was ready to go to war, the war had finished. He did some initial service. He enlisted as soon as he could when he was 18. And by the time he finished his training and everything, the war was pretty much over. So his intentions were good, but thankfully he missed any any shooting wars.
Yeah.
So we'll go back to the movie now, shall we?
Yeah, that was quite a lot of reality there.
Yeah. The next scene, we're at a party where Costner's O'Donnell meets Adlai Stevenson, and Stevenson tells him that he thinks he's cut his own political throat in trying to be the voice of reason and suggests, can we talk or trade our way out of this? Do we really have to go to war? Adlai Stevenson warns O'Donnell that the New York Times are going to run the story the next day, so the cat's out of the bag, it would seem. Then we see JFK call the editor of the New York Times, and he asks him to hold off publishing the story. Asked why the press should hold off again after the Bay of Pigs, which dropped the minute, JFK says that they'll be saving lives. And he says something like, they'll be saving lots of lives, including their own. The editor then agrees that he'll hold off, and JFK's got a bit more time. At the White House the next day, Bobby tells O'Donnell that the president wants to talk to General LeMay again. He hasn't ruled out airstrikes. Challenged to guarantee that they can capture all of the Soviet missiles, the military chiefs tell JFK that they guarantee 95%. The 95% of the ones that they know about. So
I know that's quite pithy, that bit, isn't it? So now we
yeah,
can
the
get
silence
90% of the ones that we know about. Now I do realise I've got something wrong here. I just put the numbers for DEFCON the wrong way round. But JFK does say, order worldwide US forces to raise the DEFCON level, which is the defence condition, to level 3. Now these range from 5, which is peacetime, to 1, which is all-out war.
Yeah, okay,
so
thanks.
He raises DEFCON to 3.
Which is pretty serious, and when you do that, the Soviets would know pretty much as well? Or they try and keep that secret? Yeah, okay, it's big news.
Yeah, no, that's pretty open.
Okay, so under pressure from the press, Congress and the military chiefs, O'Donnell grabs the president and gives him a pep talk. He tells Kennedy that he has to make the best call he can, and they'll just have to take their beatings as they go. The president says he's about to go on TV, and we get the feeling that he still doesn't know exactly what he's going to do or say. In reality, Stevenson had been, as I said, Stevenson was criticised by some other ex-com members who thought that his idea of removing their Turkey missiles would fail and would be a sign of weakness and the very last thing that they should do. JFK was in fact able to persuade the New York Times editor and some other pressmen to hold off on publishing through at this time in the early part of the crisis. And the order that he gave to raise to DEFCON 3 is true, as is the self-doubt and soul-searching that we saw in the movie, attested by many in the White House insiders who saw him behave as the crisis unfolded.
Yeah, and then I think his next step is quite a brave move. And so back to the movie, in front of the assembled press, John F. Kennedy goes on television. He tells the American people about the Soviet military build-up on Cuba and that there are nuclear missiles on the island. He announces that they're going to take the following initial steps. They're going to initiate a quarantine, turn back any ships carrying offensive military weapons. He also reveals that they are prepared to take further steps, including military action if it's required. We're then told it's rolled over to Tuesday the 23rd of October. O'Donnell's congratulating the speechwriter, this is Ted Sorensen, on his speech, and says, well, you had to do 2 copies, didn't you? And Sorensen says, no, I never managed to write the airstrikes version. Obviously haunted by what it might lead to.
And the speech you're referring to is the president's speech the earlier night on national TV. Yeah, he's being O'Donnell is congratulating the speechwriter for that. But you're telling us that, according to the movie at least, he only ever got to write one version, not the nasty one. We then see the president with his close advisors as they read the Soviets' response to the news that they're going to blockade Cuba. It's a speech about the freedom of the seas, and they recognise that the Soviet words are just bluster. The Soviets don't know what to do, but the US Navy chief predicts that the Soviet ships will attempt to run the blockade. Then they'll fire some warning shots, and if the Soviet ships ignore them, the US will then attempt to cripple them by firing on their rudders. JFK orders that no shots are to be fired without his explicit instructions. O'Donnell and JFK realise that the military are trying to take control away from the president. O'Donnell knows that the military want a war, and they'll use the president's rules of engagements to engineer an escalation. O'Donnell thinks it's to make up for the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which JFK signed off, but only immediately after becoming president. All the work had been done by Eisenhower, his predecessor. So shall we compare that to reality?
I mean, the movie, with a little bit of dramatic effect, I think, gives the impression that almost as he's going in front of the cameras, JFK still hasn't decided which speech he's going to give. And in reality, I think we're pretty sure that he knew what decision had been made. The speechwriter was Ted Sorensen, and he's credited with much of the close advice to JFK that the movie has given Kenny O'Donnell, the Kenny O'Donnell role. The suggestion that the military trying to create a situation which will lead to war has been rejected by most commentators, both at the time and since, and even the McNamara group, who were vehemently opposed to military action until all other options had been exhausted. They've never suggested that military chiefs were trying to manufacture a situation that will run out of control. That said, Curtis LeMay was certainly what we would now describe as a hawk, and he did describe the Russians as a big red dog that's in our backyard and needs shooting. So
he's got a good turn of phrase, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Okay, so things are getting a bit frantic now. The public are aware of the crisis, and there'll be a whole lot of extra things to manage now that the public's on board. But in the movie, we see O'Donnell stepping up again and taking a key role. He phones a Navy fighter bomber squadron leader, and he tells him that as they're about to go out over Cuba, even if his squadron are shot at, then they're not to be shot at. If they're shot down, they're not to get shot down. He's playing a word game with this commander, Flight Commander Ecker. Flight Commander Ecker is so confused that Donald explains that if they're shot at, the president will have to authorise retaliatory attacks on the sites that shot at them, and that could quickly escalate to a very nasty situation. He asks the commander not to need the president's protection. The pilot finally understands that he's to downplay any military aggression that they encounter towards the planes, and he grudgingly agrees. Then he informs his wingman that they are conducting a low-level photo run over the Cuban countryside. They make it back okay, but both planes are riddled with bullet holes, but the commander tells his men to say that they were bird strikes. Lots and lots of sparrows, no bullets on their wings. The commander then returns the call to O'Donnell, and he tells him that he's been ordered to deliver the film personally. O'Donnell asks him not to reveal that he was shot at. On arrival, LeMay asks the commander if he was shot at. It was a cakewalk, he replied. So, this little ruse of O'Donnell to prevent things from escalating, he's gone straight, put himself right into the action, given some direct commands to a military person who followed them to a T, and, O'Donnell has saved the day. How do they do on that one?
Yeah, the everything I've read says the idea that O'Donnell directly called Air Force and Navy pilots to ask them to lie to their commanders is nonsense and done for cinematic reasons. Even the producers and director Roger Donaldson admit that this is a fictional device, but it does convey the tension and the awareness of the American political leadership that one single incident could easily snowball into a really dangerous escalation. Commander Ecker, he flew his Crusader, his F-8 Crusader, with his wingman over Cuba at low level, and they did get some really good footage, and all the Crusaders made it back alive, but certainly not undamaged. They were hit, but a decision was made not to hit the SAM site or the sites that had fired at them. I think probably aware that under international law they were potentially hostile nations, and they were just flown their warplanes over this potentially hostile country, and it's kind of within the Cubans' rights to fire back.
Yeah, a defensive position is justified, whereas the offensive one that the Americans would be harder to justify.
Yeah.
So back to the movie, we see Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He's chairing a meeting of the OAS, and they agree unanimously that the quarantine has their full support. Now, this is the Order of American States. What's the OAS?
Organization of American States.
Yeah, which is a whole bunch of American countries, South American and Central American countries, and they're all on board with the President's decision to quarantine Cuba. We have a newsreel reveal that the US has detonated a hydrogen bomb over the Pacific, and then we hear that the Soviets have publicly condemned that test, and the President admits that the timing could have been a bit better. So it's purely coincidence, but it's a shame that there's some belligerent action in the Pacific by the US testing a huge bomb. JFK then compares their current situation to the lead up to World War I, when people didn't understand there was some new technology about, and war was going to make life a living hell, and if they weren't careful, they would be unable to prevent a war coming. It's a chilling scenario that he lays out in the movie, and we've got a clip of that right now.
Last summer I read a book, The Guns of August. I wish every man on that blockade line had read that book. It's World War I. It's 13 million killed. It was all because the militaries of both alliances believed they were so highly attuned to one another's movements and dispositions they could predict one another's intentions, but all their theories were based on the last war. And the world and technology had changed, and those lessons were no longer valid. But it was all they knew, so the orders went out. Couldn't be rescinded. But why couldn't they stop it? What could they have done? Here we are 50 years later. I think one of their ships resists the inspection. And we shoot out its rudder and board. They shoot down one of our planes in response. So we bomb their anti-aircraft sites in response to that. They attack Berlin. So we invade Cuba. And they fire their missiles. And we fire ours.
Yeah, so you can see that Kennedy's very, very aware how one small incident could spark an escalation that leads up with global thermonuclear warfare. Meanwhile, we see Kenny O'Donnell tell his wife to be ready to take the kids and get out of Washington if he calls. She's scared, but he tries to reassure her, no, everything will be fine, this is just in case. Robert Kennedy tries to persuade Kenny O'Donnell to go home, but he says, no, I'll let my wife sleep. And he heads out for a nighttime walk. We see newspapers being dropped at stands with headlines dominated by the growing tension. And there are queues forming outside churches as people want to go and have their confession taken. And it's only like a 30, 45 second clip of these different scenes he sees on his walk. But it really gets home this idea that Ben Robertson, in his original recommendation of the movie, said it was scary. People were thinking it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And expecting to wake up to air raid sirens. And in the movie, you see little clips of schools practicing the duck and cover technique, which,
No, I agree. I think that one scene, that collection of images in that scene is fantastic, and it really does bring home, without any real words being spoken, of the sort of fear that people must have had with 24-hour confessionals, for heaven's sake.
Yeah. And now, sorry.
Go on.
I was going to say, one point that the movie does make is that the OAS has never made a unanimous decision before, and yet now they have. So, and this is true, that they did unanimously support the American action. So you do wonder, what did the Americans have to offer some of the countries in the OAS? I mean, some would have been seen themselves as the American allies naturally anyway. but it's probably a mix of carrot and stick. And again, the World War One analogy shows the willingness of John F. Kennedy and his team to try and learn from the lessons of history. But yeah, and that as we said, those clips were really good.
I take it this would have been big. This obviously would have been big news all over the world. It centred on the American reaction, but the whole world must have been fearful of a nuclear war breaking out across the whole northern hemisphere.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly Europe. It was everything that everyone was looking at in Europe at that time because of NATO and the fact that we were all tied in together. Now, Britain had their own nuclear weapons by '62. I believe France did it as well. So that, which immediately, of course, made Britain and France targets. And Germany was next door to Soviet-held East Germany, and you had Berlin. So the whole of Europe was thinking, okay, here we go.
Is this it?
Yeah. The inevitability of war didn't play out in the Cold War, but this was probably, as far as I'm aware, this is about as close as we ever came during the Cold War.
Okay, so back to the film.
Yeah.
Okay, we learn now that it's Wednesday, the 24th of October, and we're at the White House, and the President and the full team are being briefed that the Soviet ships are inbound towards Cuba, and they're not slowing down, no sign of stopping. 2 freighters are heading on and are about to be intercepted by the US blockading warships. The American Navy realise that the Russians are escorting the freighters with some submarines. So tension is mounting as the President asks to be put through to the captain of the USS Pierce, the US warship on the scene. The captain is asked directly if he can force the sub to the surface without damaging it. The captain says he can try. The President asks him to try, but then a report comes in that the 2 Soviet freighters are stopping. He tells the warships to hold off firing on the submarine, and his orders arrive just in the nick of time. So it seems they're getting some success with these ships slowing down. Next, they hear that the Soviet ships are in fact turning around, and their whole operation room bursts out into cheers. Dean Russ comments that they've just been eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. Next, we see the President being told that nearly all the Soviet ships have turned around, but 6 are continuing. They now have to decide what to do with these 6, although 4 of them at least are a day away from getting to the quarantine line. So things are hotting up now, aren't they?
Yeah, and in reality, this is the point where the tension for the White House team really started to get to ramp up and get really intense. I mean, there's this thing, the Kennedy administration was nicknamed Camelot because it was a little bit of, they were seen as these righteous warriors for truth and justice, or how they saw themselves. I think sometimes it's used as a slightly derogatory term towards them, but
that it was a sort of a la-la land, an ideal that, that will never be achieved again.
And Kevin Costner made a point about the release of this film, saying hopefully it might make people look at them again, because a lot had come out in the 90s about JFK's womanizing, use of recreational drugs, and and they were quite derided. They also almost became anti-heroes, the pair of the brothers. And yet, as Kevin Costner points out, he showed real leadership during this period, and calm leadership, with an awareness that he had a responsibility to the whole of the world, not just to his administration and his country. So we have most of the Soviet freighters turning back, despite being escorted by submarines. The incident with the USS Pierce nearly attacking the submarine is strangely toned down from reality. Soviet submarine B-59 had gone deep to try and evade the US Navy ship, shadowing the freighters, so it hadn't been able to pick up US civilian radio traffic, which it had been listening to for news updates, nor messages from their HQ back in Russia. So they didn't know what had happened to the crisis or the conflict, what was happening on the surface. US ships, what they started doing was dropping practice depth charges, which have got the strength of about a hand grenade, so it's going to make a lot of noise, but it's not actually going to do anything to damage a sub. This was to let the subs know that they were detected, to try to force them to the surface. Unknown to the US Navy, B-59 carried a nuclear-tipped torpedo with a charge similar in strength to the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The sub's captain, Captain Valentin Savitsky, had the authority to fire such a torpedo, but only in event that Russia had been attacked. Not just in defence of his submarine, he had to know that Russia had been attacked. And he also needed, thankfully for the world, he needed the next 2 most senior officers on board to confirm the order. One of them, Captain Vasily Arkhipov, He was equal in rank to Captain Savitsky, but commanded the 3 submarine detachment that they were part of, so technically he held a senior appointment. Well, Vasily refused. He said, no, I think the Americans are trying to communicate with them, not to sink or damage us. So he refused to confirm the order to fire this nuclear-tipped torpedo. The US Navy had been broadcasting they were only firing practice rounds in an attempt to avoid escalation whilst still taking firm action, but these transmissions had not been received by the Soviet submarines. So eventually the submarine B-59 surfaced. It wasn't boarded, it wasn't fired upon by the Americans, and it did eventually head home to Russia. As the title of a National Geographic article about Vasily Arkhipov says, you, and just about everyone else you know, owes your life to this man. If you go onto YouTube and you put in Vasily Arkhipov or The Man Who Saved the World, there are a number of documentaries ranging from 5-minute clips to 1.5 hour full documentaries about this guy. We didn't even know he existed till I think about 2000, about the time that this movie was coming out, where some records were released and his name came out. Was it 2002 and he died in 2000?
Oh my God! Talk about an unsung hero.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a fantastic story, Mark.
Absolutely incredible story.
And as you say, they're playing down the tension. They could have had increased the narrative and improved the story if they'd gone straight with the truth. But I suppose that they're not showing anything in the whole movie from the Soviet side, are they? Other than the ambassador talking here and there, we don't get any representation of what the Soviets were thinking. And
we only get the ambassador, the Soviet interaction is only when it's interacting with the Americans. So I wouldn't be hard on it. It's not trying to give a balanced view. It's trying to give the point of view of the Kennedy administration.
Kennedy administration, yeah. Okay, well, let's get back to the action. In the movie, the president we see is furious that he's learned that General Taylor and Curtis LeMay have taken it upon themselves to raise the DEFCON status at Strategic Air Command to DEFCON 2. It was at 3, which is pretty serious, and they took it upon themselves to raise it to 2, which is even more serious. He dresses down General Taylor, who then leaves. The President asks Kenny O'Donnell to give him a minute with his brother. He suggests using the Adlai-Stevenson idea to trade the US missiles in Turkey for the Soviet ones in Cuba, and leaking that to the press. O'Donnell is then collared by one of the military hawks who want him to turn the Kennedy brothers away from this course of action. O'Donnell gives the guy an earful before joining the president, who's watching the TV, where the Soviet ambassador is raging about American aggression. Kennedy tells O'Donnell to get Adlai-Stevenson to stick it to them. O'Donnell is on the line awaiting Adlai when Bobby comes in and tells him that no one thinks Adlai-Stevenson is up to it. Now, this is all playing out in the United Nations. The Soviet ambassador on TV is ranting at the United Nations, and Adlai-Stevenson is the US ambassador to the UN, so it would be his job to give a response. So in the UN, we see the Soviet representative now. He's haranguing Adlai-Stevenson, who's joined them at the UN. He's asking where the American evidence is of these alleged missiles. Listening intently to the translation in his earpiece, Stevenson is making notes before it's his turn to speak. Stevenson quickly retorts that they do have evidence, and we've got a clip of, I think, the real Adlai-Stevenson giving the speech that's now portrayed in the movie.
Yeah, it's an edited clip. It's to remove some quite long periods of laughter, which some of it I wasn't quite clear what was being laughed at. And the Russian retorts in Russians, and the sound quality is a little bit, well, it's like listening to a gramophone record, which for our younger listeners, just ask someone old what that means. So this is the real Adlai-Stevenson at the UN.
And finally, the other day, Mr. Zorin, I remind you that you didn't deny the existence of these weapons. Instead, we heard that they had suddenly become defensive weapons. But today, again, if I heard you correctly, you now say they don't exist, or that we haven't proved they exist. All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no? Я не нахожусь в прокурорском плане.
put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your
You're in
reply.
the court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
I should like to say,
Sir, will you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
Stevenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
So back into the movie, as they watch it, Bobby Kennedy had been on the phone saying, look, I don't think Stephen's up to this. You're going to have to send one of your staffers in to take over from him. Yeah, we're going to pull him out. And then he's watching the performance on television, and then he just gets back on the phone and goes, no, I'll get back to you. It's fine. And hangs up. And they realise that actually Stevenson's done a pretty good job. And he then presents, and there's loads of clips you can watch of the real, either from the movie or from the real UN, where they put all these photographs up. And it's the way he pins down the Soviets' ambassador to the UN. And the Soviets were the chair of, it was their turn to be chair of the Permanent Security Council. So they controlled who could speak. So he'd say, the Soviet ambassador would say, okay, thank you, Mr. Stevenson, you've had your bit. Okay, we recognise Chile. And Chile said, yeah, we're going to give up our space on the ground and give it back to Adlai Stevenson. And apparently a lot of the Latin American countries did this. So Adlai Stevenson basically had unlimited time. I love his I'll wait here till hell freezes over if that's your decision. But he really pinned him down, and you know, that's where you can afford to be aggressive in the UN by dialogue, I think, and he does a really good job.
I was just going to ask you, what about, that's a little bit of reality check there we've done for Adlai Stevenson. What about the military leaders taking upon themselves to ratchet up the pressure to DEFCON 2? Is that at all real?
What I've managed to find is the global level was raised to level 3, but the Strategic Air Command raised their DEFCON level was raised to 2, which meant that the nuclear bombers, the B-52s with the bombs on, took off, and there were always a number of them in the air, being air-to-air refueled on like a rolling thing. So they were protected from a first strike. They'd already be in the air, and the missiles came up to a higher level of readiness. What I haven't been able to find out is whether that was ordered by JFK. Maybe that was standard, that SAC always operated one level above everyone else. I don't know until you get to 1, because there isn't a higher level. What I did find out was when the raising of to DEFCON 2 was ordered, General Thomas S. Power, who sounds another Curtis LeMay-style gung-ho warrior, he made sure that it was broadcast to the SAC stations around the world in clear, not in code, so the Soviets would know that it had happened. Again, I've been unable to find out if that was authorised, but several articles suggest that no, he did that off his own bat. Now, you could argue he's trying to generate attention or something, I don't know, but...
And the suggestion that Adlai Stevenson was reluctant or weak, or, you know, Bobby's on the phone ready to pull him out if he doesn't do a good job, and he needs a pep talk from O'Donnell's character. I mean, that's probably taking things a little bit too far. Adlai Stevenson was a very experienced political campaigner. He'd run for president for twice already unsuccessfully as a Democrat, and he could hold his own even though he didn't win the presidential elections. He was from the previous generation of Democrats, and some in the White House thought he might have been too old or gentle to really represent the determined stand that the administration wanted to get across to the Soviets. But as I say, he was a veteran speech giver. And he definitely wouldn't have needed a pep talk from O'Donnell, as the movie suggests. No,
and that performance of his in UN has been described by a lot of people as one of the most impressive speeches in UN history. Some other people have said there was a lot of glitzy showbiz in it, very typical sort of American Hollywood production, but it was effective. And yeah, I didn't know this, but you noticed you'd read that Colin Powell tried to almost copy the performance.
Yeah, he did, when he was presenting to the UN to try and get UN backing for the invasion of Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein. He had the same sort of approach. He had big cards with big photos enlarged onto big cards. He had pointer pointing to where they found these supposed weapons of mass destruction. The difference being in the two representations to the UN, that unlike Stevenson, Powell was not successful.
Back to the movie. we see a Soviet freighter has crossed the quarantine line, and the tension starts to mount once again. The Soviets have been closely shadowed by a US warship who uses an Aldous lamp, which is like Morse by flashing a big torch, flags and radio, but there's no response. The warship is ordered to load their guns, but the Secretary of Defense McNamara realises the admiral in the operations room has just ordered the US ship to fire and starts yelling at him to cease fire. And there's a really dramatic scene with them bawling at each other. But the admiral looks at him and he says, "We're firing star shells. They're flares. They're not offensive weapons." Undeterred, McNamara says the Soviets could... Oh, sorry, just dropped my paper. The Soviets could easily choose to misinterpret such firing. There'll be no such actions until he or the president has specifically ordered it. And you can see the tension there. The military commander saying, "You've given me the rules of engagement. This is within them. You're a politician. You know, I'm a military commander. You don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah, and the military commander trying to justify what he's saying, that they're just flares, they're not real bullets. I mean, we in the audience are thinking, what the hell is the distinction? Exactly like McNamara was saying. You know, these loud noises, these big bangs, it really could be misinterpreted and start a real shooting war.
But equally, the Soviets aboard, even though they're merchant navy, they'll know they're firing star shells. They'll know what they are. They're illuminating devices. They're not offensive weapons. But what's interesting is I could not be able to find any record that this really happened. And it's almost like it's a simplified cinematic version of the incident with the submarine described earlier. And the only thing I could think is it's really expensive if you want to show a real submarine to hire one. So maybe this was a cheaper way? I don't know. In reality, they mentioned earlier that most of the Soviet ships had turned back, but there were some continuing on. In reality, the oil tanker Bucharest continued on towards Cuba, and the two US warships were shadowing her, but President Kennedy decided to allow it to continue unhindered as they fully believed it had no contraband, i.e. war material, on board. And there was also a Lebanese registered ship called the Macon, or not Macron, that's the French president now. I can't remember what name it had, but that was stopped and searched, but it only had paper products on board, so it was allowed to continue. So, you know, there were potential confrontations, but I didn't find anything about star shells.
Well, thanks for clarifying that. So back in the movie, we're at the White House again, and another US missile test has got the president riled again. So he yells, "Who authorised this additional test?" Though they can guess the answer is some hawk or other in the military hierarchy. Bobby wonders what this will communicate to the Soviets, but O'Donnell laughs, quote, "Communicate with the Soviets? We can't even communicate with the Pentagon, and they're just across the goddamn river." Meanwhile, we see a Soviet ship is being approached by a boat from a USS destroyer, while Kennedy is being told that an approach has been made to an American journalist by a Russian man that they believe to be a KGB station chief to open a line of communication with the Kremlin. The American journalist, John Scarley, has an offer from the Russian for the president to consider. He knows he's got limited time, so Kennedy asks the assembled staffers to go all out to establish if this is likely to be a genuine lead. O'Donnell then is with some backroom staff poring over details of this apparent KGB guy, who, if he's for real, will be connected. They reason that Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, and Fomin, the KGB man, were comrades during World War II, so it's likely to be the real deal. O'Donnell reports this to Kennedy, that his gut instinct is that Khrushchev has turned to an old and trusted friend to act as an intermediary with the US president. Well, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
How do they go with the details about this contact between the Kremlin and White House?
Well, the approach to the journalist John Scarley by Alexander Fomin, which apparently is a cover name, is genuine. They do believe that he was the Washington station chief of the KGB. Now, some accounts say they think he was acting on a request from Secretary General Khrushchev. Others that his initial approach was actually on his own initiative, realising there was no secure way for the President and the First Secretary in the Soviet Union to communicate with each other, whereas, obviously, as a senior KGB officer, he could provide an information route. Either way, once the contact had been confirmed and developed, things were able to move quite quickly. And I mean, in the movie, we see Scarley meet Fomin, and the deal is that if the Soviets agree to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba, the US will guarantee they will never again invade Cuba or support anyone who does. And Scarley says to him, "I've been told to tell you, that's a deal." Kennedy is told that his analysts believe that the offer comes direct from Khrushchev, and he says, look, we should seriously consider this. So
good.
that's the movie wrapping up, and that's spot on. When I was again watching it, I was thinking, I'm surely not. But yeah, and there's quite a funny line as well when they say to this John Scully, a journalist, so all his instincts would be to, wow, what a great story I've got here, and then realising, yeah, I'm never going to be able to publish this. And O'Donnell says to him, sorry, John, no Pulitzer Prize for this one.
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. I thought it was going to definitely be Hollywood, but it turned out to be much more fact than fiction, didn't it?
No, definitely. Do you want to take us back to the movie?
We see O'Donnell. He's just gotten home, and he's immediately being recalled to the White House, so something's happened. They've gotten another message from the Soviets, but this one is much less friendly than the previous night's message. However, we see the American analysts poring over each word, and they believe that this second message is not from Khrushchev, so that they can only guess that he's been removed by a coup by some hardliners, or at least he's being persuaded by the hardliners to take a much tougher line. The Hawks are back in the ascendancy, we see. They're pushing for airstrikes and an invasion. The President orders the military to prepare the orders for a direct action option, especially as the latest photographs show that the missiles are being prepared for readiness. We see O'Donnell call another pilot, this time a U-2 pilot called Anderson. The pilot reassures him that there's lots that can go wrong at 72,000 feet, when O'Donnell asks him not to get shot down. And with some tragic predictability, as we've just been shown that Anderson is a decent, God-fearing type of guy, he's of course fired down by two SAM missiles. He avoids one, but is hit by the other, and he doesn't manage to eject and has a fiery death. O'Donnell gets told that a plane is missing, and the pilot is presumed dead. At a White House meeting, they learn that another U-2 plane has accidentally strayed into Soviet territory near Alaska, but that pilot got out okay. So things are hotting up. The generals demand permission to attack the SAM site that had shot down Major Anderson, but the President says no, he needs to wait until they're sure that it wasn't an accident. So things are getting tense again, so there's a bit of a roller coaster going on here, isn't there?
Yeah, and these multiple letters from Khrushchev, again, that's a genuine event. The first letter, which seemed very open to discussion, and look, come on, let's step back from the brink here. And then the second one, which seemed a lot more hostile, and as suggested in the movie, they basically ignore the second one and respond to the first one, and we'll come back to that later. Major Rudolph Anderson, who in reality was not called by Kenny O'Donnell, he was shot down, and he was probably killed on the initial missile hit on his plane, they believe. It turned out the order to engage his plane did not come from Moscow. The effect was galvanizing on both the White House and the Kremlin. Robert Kennedy recalled later that he and his brother felt their bridges to escape the escalating conflict were crumbling, whilst Nikita Khrushchev's son later said that his father felt very much the same way, that all the peaceful paths out of this crisis were being blocked off to them. Interestingly, around the same time, another U-2 plane became lost flying in the North Pole, where especially in the days pre-GPS days, navigation is very difficult because your compass just simply wants to point vertically down at the ground. Another U-2 plane became lost and strayed into Russian territory. Russian fighters scrambled to intercept it. US fighters were also scrambled to give cover, and yet the incident did not escalate into a dogfight. All the participants made it safely home. And one of the incredible things about that is, I read this in one of the books I read about this, that the I think it was F-5 fighters were scrambled to give the U-2 plane cover and get it back, had nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles. And I thought, no, that's nonsense. Looked it up. No, that's true. They did have them. Whether the planes that went were tipped with them or not, I don't know. But that's what this book says, and they did exist.
And for those of you that don't know, I'm no expert on aircraft, but Martin, you are. U-2 plane is designed to be a spy plane and designed to fly very, very high. And when you say you don't want to be shot down at 72,000 feet, that's approximately double what a modern passenger liner would fly at, isn't it? About 35,000 feet?
Yeah, you're about 14 miles up. You're
incredibly
on
high.
On the edge of the atmosphere. Yeah, it's what Gary Powers.
Presumably to avoid radar detection by the Soviets, is that the idea?
No, it wouldn't avoid radar, but it would avoid missiles. So they weren't very fast, they weren't very manoeuvrable, but they look like gliders. They've got incredibly long wings. If anyone just Googles U2, you'll probably get the Irish rock band, but if you put U2 spy plane, you'll see pictures of these very strange looking things, but they could fly in very long periods, very economical on fuel, and very, very high. And then they were replaced by the SR-71 Blackbird that could fly very high and very, very fast. The idea being that by the time anyone had noticed it, you scramble your fighters and they can go supersonic, but it's doing Mach 2.5 or something at 70,000 feet. It's going to be home before you've reached its altitude. So that's why they were replaced.
Right, that's the successor to the U2.
I think there was some overlap with them, but yeah. But interesting that I think that incident in a lot of the articles I've read about it, and certainly the two books I read, they talked about it was the polar one made both sides realise we're not going out here with right, let's start a fight at any cost. That was one pause of thought, and the fact that the Americans didn't immediately attack SAM sites in Cuba after the Russians had shot down the Cubans had shot down this U-2 plane. The order did come apparently from a Soviet commander in Cuba under his rules of engagement. But when it went back to Moscow, I think it gave everybody a sense that neither side is itching for a fight here. That the aggression is on the political front. Let's not make it a military front as well. So neither side wanted to be the ones who fired the first shot, even though you could argue that Major Anderson, it's tragic, but a guy did lose his life, but better one person than millions.
Yeah, so thankfully level heads prevailed on both sides of the conflict. Let's get back to the movie. In the next scene, we see Kenny O'Donnell is at his son's school watching him play American football. Everyone's trying to get on with a normal life despite all the tension. Kenny Jr. runs across and he's clearly pleased that his dad has come to see him. He's asked if everything is going to be okay, and O'Donnell tells his son yes, it'll all be fine. Back at his office, we see O'Donnell learn that the Kennedys have agreed to do the deal with their missiles in Turkey. He's against the move, as the Soviets will then demand deal after deal until they're dealing over Berlin, and then they'll be at war again. Anyway, Bobby Kennedy says that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete anyway, and they were due to be withdrawn in the next year or so. In a strange role reversal, O'Donnell is coming over hawk-like, and Bobby Kennedy is all for being the deal-maker. They decide to carry on, agreeing with the first letter from Khrushchev and pretend the second one didn't exist. They say that they'll dismantle and remove the missiles in Turkey, but in 6 months' time, so that there's no connection with the Cuban situation, and if the Soviets go public, the US will deny it. Bobby Kennedy is tasked with delivering the message and making sure that it's clearly understood. O'Donnell drives him to his office as they wonder why they worked so hard to get to the White House and whether it was all worth it. O'Donnell jokes with him, but it also peps Bobby up. Passing the Soviet embassy, they see some white smoke pouring from the embassy's chimneys, and they realise they're burning all their documents, and makes them wonder if they really are about to go to war.
Yeah, that's quite a chilling scene, isn't it? They look up and they see this white smoke pouring out, and they go, "Oh my God!" The Soviet embassy think we're about to go to war. These Turkish-based Jupiter missiles, they had been scheduled for withdrawal at some future point, but they'd only gone to Turkey the year before. So I'm not sure if they would have been considered obsolete quite that quickly. And the need to keep their impending withdrawal, or the impending withdrawal of the Jupiter missiles secret, wasn't just to save face, though. They had been deployed there to reassure NATO allies. So if the Americans unilaterally withdrew them because there were nukes close to America, you could get the European NATO countries going, hang on a sec, we've got Soviet missiles, in Germany's case, a mile away over the border sort of thing, or they potentially could be. So just because some are close to you, now you're getting all twitchy and so it could have caused it could have been very disruptive to relationships within NATO. So I think that's more the insistence that any deal involving the Jupiter missiles will be kept quiet.
But the fact that there's a secret, in the movie, the fact that there's a secret part of the deal that the US will withdraw the Turkish missiles, that is a fact, isn't it? They didn't invent that just for the movie.
Well, no, it is a fact, but interestingly, it didn't emerge till after Glasnost. and it was denied by all the people involved in it. In their memoirs, Bobby Kennedy's memoirs were posthumously published after his death, after his assassination in '68. But then when, in the end of the 80s, when the Soviets released a lot of information, and the Soviet Union, or Russia, Cuba and America got together, and they kind of recreate, I think they had a conference or something. It might have been political scientists, I'm not sure. What can we learn about how we managed to avoid conflict getting worse? And they looked at it, and this is when it emerged, and Ted Sorensen actually said, no, it was in one of the draft speeches, since destroyed. And a few people sort of went, yeah, it was part of the deal. And it became clear. So by the time this film was made, it was known that the Jupiter missiles were very much part of the deal. But it had been denied for 20 years, over 20 years, nearly 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that it was ever involved.
That's a great fact, yeah, because that would make Kennedy look like the clear victor, that he stared down Khrushchev without giving anything up. But the truth is a bit more complicated. Okay, well, we're getting towards the end of the movie, even though there's still some suggestion that it might be war, given what the Soviet embassy were doing. In the movie, we arrive at the Justice Department, and Bobby Kennedy is told that the Soviet ambassador is in his office. Kenny O'Donnell offers to whistle him up some luck. Waiting in the seating out area outside Bobby's office, O'Donnell sees a lady with a Soviet badge on her lapel, who asks who he is. Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador spar over the terms of what they're negotiating, and we've got a bit of a clip of that right now, haven't we?
Yeah.
At this moment, the president is accepting the terms of Secretary Khrushchev's letter of Friday night. If the Soviet Union halts construction immediately, removes the missiles, and submits to UN inspection, the United States will pledge to never invade Cuba or aid others in that enterprise.
If your Jupiter missiles in Turkey were removed also, such an accommodation could be reached.
That's not possible. The United States cannot agree to such terms under threat. Any belief to the contrary was in error.
You want war?
However, while there can be no quid pro quo on this issue, the United States can offer a private assurance. Now, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and have been scheduled for withdrawal for some time. This withdrawal should take place within, say, 6 months. Of course, any public disclosure of this assurance would negate the deal and produce the most stringent denials from our government.
This private assurance represents the word of the highest authority.
Now, the last thing you hear in the clip, which unfortunately ends at that point, is the Soviet ambassador say, does this offer come from the highest authority, meaning the president, and Robert Kennedy is able to assure him. And you get the feeling that actually this is a big thawing moment, and that there's been a bit of a meeting of minds with some great release. The two men clearly understand each other and appear to have reached an agreement. The Soviet ambassador assures Bobby Kennedy he'll bring a reply the next day. The next day, we hear a news report that General Khrushchev has agreed to dismantle and remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba to avoid the growing risk of war. Kenny O'Donnell is at home with his family, clearly moved by emotion at what they've all been through, probably exhausted as well. At the White House, President Kennedy is being applauded and cheered by his staff, but he warns him, he says, don't gloat, this is as much a victory for the Soviets as it was for us. Alone in the Oval Office, JFK dictates a letter to the parents of Major Anderson, the U-2 pilot that we saw being killed. The final scene sees the Kennedy brothers and O'Donnell chatting, and O'Donnell looks at a paperweight on the president's desk that reads, "Oh God, your sea is so great and my boat is so small." The end. I quite like that little saying. I thought that's a good way of. It's almost like the Roman generals who'd be given a triumph through Rome. And the tradition was you'd have a slave whispering in your ear, "Remember, you are but a mortal man." Yeah.
Very, very
Similar
levelling,
sort of
very
thing.
grounding.
Yeah.
So why don't we wrap up that last bit, Martin? According to several sources, President Kennedy himself had met the Soviet ambassador a couple of times before the crucial meeting between the ambassador and Bobby. But it appears that it was in fact the meeting between the ambassador and Bobby that the deal was laid out as the movie suggests. The assurance was given that the US would neither invade Cuba nor support anyone else trying to do the same, and that they would in fact remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The result of the negotiations was that the Soviets agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles from Cuba, and the Americans undertook never to invade the island, and a year later they did in fact quietly remove their Jupiter missiles as they'd promised. It's hard to realise that living in the world that we do today with 24-hour rolling news, but part of the problem faced by Kennedy and his people was not really knowing what was going on in Moscow. And, we've saw them even wondering if Khrushchev at one stage had been removed as a coup, and they had no way to confirm this or not. So direct communication was a great problem, and that led to the installation the following year of the mythical, no, real, hotline that would enable the President and the Soviet Premier to pick up the phone and speak directly to each other in the event of any similar future crisis.
Yeah, and I think on JFK, he had been criticised for weakness over Berlin and the Bay of Pigs debacle. People take the mickey out of him for saying Ich bin ein Berliner, which basically means I'm a donut. He should have said Berlin man, I think. But he did stand up to both the Soviets and probably more impressively, or just as impressively, much older and more experienced hawks in his own administration. And whatever people think of him now, that the shenanigans of his private life are known, he showed a high level of leadership during the period. Khrushchev, he lasted another 2 years as first secretary before being replaced by his deputy, Leonid Brezhnev, by which time John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. Brother Robert would be campaigning for the Democratic president nomination in '68 when he's also assassinated. And of course, Fidel Castro would outlast them all. Now, the USA undertook never to invade, but they certainly didn't lapse on the assassination attempts against him. In fact, the key character in Bridge of Spies, which we covered, probably about 18 months ago now, this lawyer who was used so effectively to go around the world negotiating on behalf of the United States, he was sent to visit Castro, or to meet Castro, and the CIA wanted him to go scuba diving with Castro. Apparently loved scuba diving, and give him a wetsuit that was poisoned. I mean, they did all sorts. I believe supposedly there's like 600 assassination attempts against Castro, none of which were successful, and which kind of makes you question the effectiveness of the CIA. Sorry, I didn't say that out loud, just in case they come after me and prove
that was Martin that said that. Just to make that clear, Martin said that.
Castro's interesting. In the event on his death, opinion was split around the world. The anti-Castro sentiments often being spearheaded by people reminding that he did during this period. If you read the headline, he urged Khrushchev to use a first strike, use his nuclear weapons against the USA. Actually, if you read it in context, what he said was, in the event of an American invasion of Cuba, I would urge that you use everything at your disposal to stop the imperialist, empire builders, blah, blah, blah. And what the Americans weren't aware of was that the Soviets had frog missiles, or they became aware shortly afterwards. These are very short-range tactical battlefield nukes, which could have probably destroyed any invasion by nuking the beaches of Cuba as the Americans landed. And it's difficult for us now to convey the sense of imminent doom, which we've mentioned earlier. Ben put it so well in the email, which I tried finding, but I suspect I've deleted it once we read it out when it was first sent. But, it really was a horrible period, especially if you imagine someone like, I can't remember how old Ben said he was. I think he was maybe a fairly young boy, but remembering his parents being really scared, thinking, am I going to get a chance to grow up here? And especially anyone who was living on the East Coast and the southern East Coast, the Washington, Virginia, Florida, those areas so close to Cuba, thinking we may not even get that much notice. Now, you've got some notes about Kenny O'Donnell.
Yeah, we mentioned that, of course, JFK was assassinated in '63 and Bobby in June of 1968. The other key player, of course, in this telling is Kenny O'Donnell. He was with JFK when he was assassinated in Dallas in November of 1963, and he even testified at the Warren Commission. He stayed on for his job as an advisor to President Johnson for a year or two. He then left the White House to run for governor of Massachusetts in '66, but was unsuccessful. He then fell back with the Kennedys, and he was actually Bobby's campaign manager in the 1968 presidential campaign. I haven't been able to find whether he was president when Bobby was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, but, the impact of both those assassinations, including Bobby, who was, after all, his best friend from college days, apparently haunted O'Donnell for the rest of his life. He turned to the bottle, and in 1977 he finally died at the age of 53 from some alcohol-related gastrointestinal problems. So, pretty tragic ending for all three of the main protagonists, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the strength of leadership that Kennedy showed, and then, just over a year later, he's dead.
Yeah.
And you do wonder what could have been, Kennedy was known to be planning to pull out of Vietnam in the early to mid-60s, so it would never have escalated into this 10-year disaster that really hit the Americans at all levels of society. I don't know, I'm not going to get into JFK conspiracy theories, but...
Good call, Martin, I tell you. Just walk away from that one.
Yeah, but it does give you the what if. What if he hadn't died? What if,
Well, regardless of how he died or who was behind it, there's definitely, unending scope for what ifs about if Kennedy had survived. His legacy, as you say, is more than what people might have thought for a while. When you think about the space movies that the exploration of space movies that we've addressed with The Right Stuff and Hidden Figures, I mean, that's all his legacy for sure. Why don't we wrap this one up? We've got to give a couple of scores.
I really enjoyed it. If you haven't seen this movie, watch it. It's really gripping. The performances, as we said earlier, when you're going to portray someone who's so well known, who's been filmed so many times, there's so many clips of the Kennedys out there, it's really difficult. I think Bruce Greenwood and Stephen Culp did a fantastic job, as did Kevin Costner. He has got this slightly weird accent. I don't know if it's a bad attempt or if it's just that's what Boston Irish sounds like. I'm sure some of our American friends can guide us on that one, but
I think the actors that did the Kennedys got the Boston accent a bit more right than what Costner did. But nonetheless, as you say, I wasn't expecting a lot from this film. I thought it might be good and a bit historically interesting, but I thought it was really well executed and well acted. I think the dialogue, the editing, I think it makes for a very, very entertaining film, and I'd give it at least, 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I'd agree with 8 out of 10. But yeah, I thought it was portrayed very well. There's a bit of fiction in there with Kenny O'Donnell ringing up
that's what
fighter pilots, but
I was going to say that the making Kenny O'Donnell such a key figure was, as you pointed out at the start, the glaring historical mistake. But we've seen this sort of adjustment to the narrative, giving one person the story through one person's eyes, as really about the only way you could try and convey something as complex and as multifaceted as this would have been. They distill it down to one person's family, one person's eyes, and we see the action unveil through him. I'm not going to really mark them down for that.
No.
Well, I was just going to say, what about the rest of the history as far as the movie goes? I reckon it's pretty good.
I think it's a 7.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let them off with not showing the Vasily Arkhipov element, the submarine flotilla commander who said, no, we're not going to fire nuclear torpedoes, and we're not going to fire torpedoes at all, because I don't think he was known about when the movie was made. I think it was maybe 2002 that awareness of him came to the fore. Plus, that's not the focus. They're not trying to give a history of the global event. They're just giving the White House administration's perspective. So yeah, no, I think at least a 7.
Yeah, I think I might give it an 8 for both.
Yeah, 7 or 8. Yeah, I'll go 8 for entertainment and 7 for history.
And I'll go 8 for both, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, so good job, guys.
Okay, well, let's wrap this one up, I guess. Next time out, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll be looking at Reversal of Fortune, won't we?
We will indeed, and we're going to be joined, all things being well, by our dear friend Sean Munger, who's rejoining us, host of the Second Decade podcast, which is fantastic. Although, Sean, you haven't put an episode out for way too long. I know you might be busy, but yeah, Sean's hopefully going to come back on with us for that one. And this is about New York socialite Count Klaus von Bülow, who was accused of murdering his wife.
Sonny von Bülow, yeah, and Sean Munger He's a great fan of the film. He knows lots about the truth behind the story. He's got a lawyer's perspective on it, so he'll be a great addition to the episode in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, because if you haven't noticed, Sean is a teacher, an author, historian, a climate environmental scientist, and a lawyer. It's like, okay, everything we mentioned, he's probably going to turn out he's the quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks.
I was going to say, Martin, that's all we know so far, so let's just see what else he can surprise us with. On that note, let's wrap it up until next time. See you in a couple of weeks.